Hello, everyone. I am Cammy.
Hello,
What's your name?
Liam.
This is from Mad Max to the Matrix, where I introduce this here 13-year-old to classic movies from the 80s and 90s. What did we watch?
Commando, Return to Oz, and Pee-wee's Big Adventure.
Right, spotlight on 1985. Going forward, there will be no restraint on spoilers, so you have been warned. I do want to mention real quick a bit of housekeeping. I think it was the last time we said that we were going to aim to do an episode every 2 weeks. That also is kind of untenable, especially now that you're back in school. So what I think the best plan is just, watch movies when we can and record when we can, and thus get the episodes out when we can.
Okay.
Now, last time we skipped the movie that you had previously seen because I mistook it for a different movie. So you had seen from 1984, you had seen The Neverending Story.
Yeah.
Do you remember a lot about that movie?
No.
Do you remember enough that you'd be able to give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down?
Thumbs up.
Thumbs up? Okay. I remember you liking it. Movies that you previously seen from 1985 is Back to the Future. Did you like Back to the Future?
Yes.
Yeah. Would you give that a thumbs up or a thumbs down?
Definitely a thumbs up.
Okay. So let's get started with Commando. Here on From Mad Max to the Matrix, Liam rates every movie on a 5-star rating from 1 star to 5 stars. 1 star is hated it, 2 stars is didn't like it, 3 stars is liked it, 4 stars is really liked it, and 5 stars is loved it. How would you rate Commando?
4 stars.
4 stars?
I like that I didn't have to really think while I was watching it.
Yeah, that is definitely not a thinking movie. I love that movie. It's so dumb. How would you summarize the plot of the film?
What's the guy's name? The main character?
John Matrix.
So John Matrix gets basically his daughter gets kidnapped, so he goes on a mission to go find her and make sure that she's still alive.
Yep. And he kills everybody along the way.
Yep.
That is it exactly.
He also picks up a phone booth and throws it.
He does. Good Lord. That movie it's only 90 minutes long, and it's 90 minutes of just action movie nonsense. So some context. The movie stars friend of the channel, Arnold Schwarzenegger. We've seen him, I think 3 times at this point?
Terminator 1, Terminator 2, Commando. Right?
We haven't watched Terminator 2 yet. We saw him in, as far as the show is concerned, we saw him in Conan, Terminator, and now this. The movie also stars Rae Dawn Chong. I don't remember, she was the woman in the movie. I don't remember her character's name because she was not that important. An interesting thing that we'll come back to, or an interesting thing that I want to mention that will come back when we talk about the next movie. She's the daughter of a famous comedian, Tommy Chong, who was part of a comedy group in the 70s and called Cheech and Chong, and they did a bunch of movies. It also starred Alyssa Milano, who was his daughter. She went on to, or maybe she had already done it. No, I think she went on. Anyway, she went on to be in a pretty famous sitcom, and now she's a political activist. The other actor that's worth mentioning is the guy who played Bennett, the bad guy. He's played by a guy named Vernon Wells, who we've seen previously. He was in Mad Max 2. He played the guy with the red mohawk, who goes absolutely insane when his boyfriend gets a boomerang to the head. So do you have any questions? Well, there's not much for context more about that movie. Schwarzenegger was already established as like a big action star after Conan and Terminator, and this is just kind of one of the first of a string of action movies that he started making. We're going to see him a lot because he was all over the place in the 80s and 90s. So do you have any questions for me about that?
Nope.
It's pretty straightforward.
Yep.
So I have a question for you, and I asked you this probably 20, 30 times while we were watching it. But did you see his muscles?
Not very often.
For anybody who hasn't seen the movie, he's introduced, Schwarzenegger's introduced by a bunch of close-ups of his bulging muscles before you ever actually see the rest of him. It's absurd, and he's always shiny. While we were watching, you had mentioned that he had a special kind of armor that he wore.
Plot armor.
Plot armor. Do you want to explain for everyone what plot armor is?
Where basically the main character is immune to anything.
Yep.
They just straight up can't die.
Yep, because the movie needs to happen. We also talked about a ticking clock. Do you remember me talking about that?
That was when something is slowly happening that makes you constantly interested.
Yep. That the characters have to continue acting or some sort of bad thing will happen. And this movie has a literal ticking clock in the watch that he puts on.
Yep.
That says, okay, when this reaches a certain time, your daughter's dead. Oh, another member of the cast that I didn't write down. It has, I forgot his name.
What do you play?
Paul Winfield. Paul Winfield also played one of the cops in Terminator, the Yo Mama, one of the detectives. And he was the guy who Schwarzenegger killed on the plane at the beginning. And do you remember his one-liner after he killed the guy? When the flight attendant came up and was like, "Does your friend need anything?"
A pillow and a blanket.
He said, "No, he's dead tired." That movie has so many stupid one-liners. It's fantastic. Normally we talk about like the theme and deeper meanings of movies.
I don't think there's really one.
100% does not. It is just a brainless action movie.
Sometimes those are good though.
Yeah, 100%. I love a good brainless action movie sometimes. So instead of that, I kind of want to talk about plot archetypes. For those of you listening along, any similarities to your freshman film studies class is purely coincidental. So let's talk plot archetypes. We've talked about them before. I think the first time we talked about it was when we watched Scarface, where I said gangster movies are a kind of a plot archetype. So it could be an action movie, it could be kind of like a drama thriller like Scarface, but it's always the same kind of things happen. You know, scrappy underdog,
Yeah.
so on and so forth. We also talked about the slasher plot archetype, which
Nightmare on Elm Street.
yeah, Nightmare on Elm Street, Alien also followed it. So we've watched movies with this particular plot archetype before, and without reading my notes, no cheating. What kind of plot archetype would you say this has?
I don't know.
We've watched other revenge movies. Do you remember talking about revenge plots?
Yes.
Specifically, we talked about it with Conan. We also talked about it with Wrath of Khan, but that's a different kind of plot archetype. The general plot archetype, at least in action movies, of a revenge story is something happens and then the main character progressively kills people until it gets to like the person most primarily responsible. And so a lot of revenge arcs will be like, oh, you killed my wife, I'm going to murder all of you. This was he was rescuing his daughter, but it's the same kind of plot archetype. Do you have anything you want to add about the movie?
How did he do how did he lift things that seemed like they should be able to be lifted?
You mean how did the character do it,
Yes.
or how did the actor do it?
The actor.
So, like the telephone booth, they basically just make it out of something that's really light. Like it's probably mostly just styrofoam with some aluminum made to look like a phone booth.
Oh.
So he actually picked up something that was pretty light. Although, this is Arnold Schwarzenegger in his heyday, so he could probably still lift something really heavy. We also talked about, we've talked quite a bit about special effects and like the precursors to blue screens of rotoscoping.
Yeah.
And do you remember me pointing out when we could see the matte lines when they
Yeah,
were on the plane?
I saw it. It was really obvious in that one.
Yeah, it's the more like wavy and fuzzy the thing that you're trying to mat around, the more obvious it is. If it's a nice flat line and like a good angle, matte lines aren't quite as obvious, but they were trying to matte around
A person.
Radon Chong's hair, and her hair is very, very curly. What was your favorite part of Commando?
I don't know.
Like the whole thing
Yeah.
is ridiculous. Do you remember the final one-liner from the movie when he stabs Bennett with the pipe?
You need to let out some steam.
Yep. That movie is so ridiculous. Okay, let's move on to Pee-wee's Big Adventure. What star rating would you give Pee-wee's Big Adventure?
5 stars.
5 stars. When we were watching it, I didn't realize you liked it quite as much because you raved about how great Commando was by laughing at it the whole time, and you were kind of quiet while we were watching Pee-wee's Big Adventure. So cool. I'm glad you liked it. Can you summarize what happens in that movie?
Pee-wee is riding his bike through the neighborhood, and he finds someone who says it's his birthday. Guy asks if he can have Pee-wee's bike. Pee-wee says no, regardless of how much money he gets. And the guy eventually steals Pee-wee's bike, and the movie is Pee-wee trying to get his bike back.
Yep. That's it exactly. So let's do some context for this one. Pee-wee Herman, the main character, was played by a guy named Paul Rubens, which, to go back to Cheech and Chong, Paul Rubens was big in the Los Angeles stand-up comedy scene, just like Cheech and Chong were. And his character, when he was on stage, was Pee-wee. This is the character he played a lot. He appeared in a bunch of Cheech and Chong's movies, was kind of how he got introduced into Hollywood. So Pee-wee Herman appears in a couple of their movies. The movie was also directed by Tim Burton, who you saw doing Beetlejuice, Edward Scissorhands, and was primarily responsible for Nightmare Before Christmas.
Huh. Interesting.
He didn't direct Nightmare Before Christmas. It was directed by, what's the guy's name? Henry Selick, I think his name is. But Burton did producer role on that, the same way like George Lucas produced the second 2 Star Wars movies without directing. This was Burton's first feature film. He had worked as an animator for Disney before this, mostly doing a lot of stop motion. So there's a lot of stop motion in this movie. We'll see Tim Burton again in a couple of times because after this, and then especially after Beetlejuice, he did just a whole slew of really good movies in the 80s and 90s, like just all top tier films. And then the 2000s came around and his career just fell apart. His movies are garbage after that. Mostly, Big Fish was good. Yeah, so we'll see him again with Batman and Batman Returns. Do you have any questions for me about Pee-wee's Big Adventure?
How did, like, when he was driving the, was it a car where he pressed the buttons and a whole bunch of different things would happen?
Oh, that was the bike.
And it was the bike?
The big chase at the end. He's got all the James Bond style spy gadgets.
Yeah.
You haven't watched any James Bond movies, but that's a staple of Bond films is to have a bunch of stupid gadgets. We'll watch some Bond movies later, but yeah. Or we'll watch one Bond movie? Yeah, I think we're only doing one. Anyway, this movie also has the original release of the movie had some really interesting production mistakes. Like the VHS cut of the movie when Pee-wee pulls up and he chains his bike to the clown statue.
Yeah, and he pulls all the wire or the chain out of his bike.
Yeah, like 6 miles of chain. The original VHS cut, you can see the bottom of the side saddle, so you can see the chain going up through a hole in the bottom of the thing. When the movie was released, it was remastered and released on DVD in the 2000s. And when they did that, you could see stuff that was not clear in the VHS cuts. Like when Pee-wee and Manny are driving around and it's nighttime and they keep seeing those crazy road signs going by and they get like increasingly insane and Pee-wee's starting to fall asleep. In the DVD version, you can see it clarifies the darkness around the signs a lot more. So you can see that they're just in a recording studio and they've got the signs on a track on a wheeled trolley, and you can see that they're just grabbing ropes and pulling them past the camera. It's completely obvious. When it was released for streaming later, they darkened that back up, so like the version we watched, you couldn't see it, and they reframed that the chain bit. The Yeah, this movie also has an interesting thing that movies do called a movie within a movie. Do you know what I mean by that?
No.
It's when you're watching a movie and there is a movie that that exists within the film, within the world of the movie. And what it so this one would be when Pee Wee sells the story of him trying to find his bicycle to Warner Brothers. They turned into a movie. You remember the scenes?
Yep.
What did you think of the movie within the movie?
It was really good.
It was good. It really leans into the ridiculous spy movie motif. Yeah, it's great, and I liked Pee Wee Herman's cameo in the movie. Do you remember that when he plays the bellhop? Mr. Herman, paging Mr. Herman, and they dub his voice with the most ridiculous thing. So that movie, we're going to continue talking about plot archetypes. That movie has a plot archetype called a road movie, which road movies usually are something happens in the first act that sends the character or characters out on like a road trip. So they're traveling somewhere. And then as they're traveling, the movie is kind of told in vignettes, which a vignette is just basically a small chunk of story that's not
Oh,
super connected to the rest. And that's how this movie works. Like, there's the part where he meets what's her name in the dinosaur.
Large Marge.
Yeah, Large Marge was part of it. There's the section with Manny in the car when he's hitchhiking. There's the section with when he's in Texas at the Alamo. So the whole movie is told in vignettes until the third act conflict with everything, which is when he gets his bicycle back. This movie also has a really clear character arc. We've talked briefly about character arcs before. Do you know what I mean when I say that?
A character growing and developing.
Yep. How the character changes or how the story forces the character to change. And this movie has a very clear, not subtle character arc of Pee Wee has to kind of learn to let other people in, to not just be a loner dotty, a rebel. Because by the end, he's made all these friends and he would have never gotten his bicycle back if he hadn't made all these friends. Do you have anything that you want to add about Pee Wee's Big Adventure?
Nope.
What was your favorite part?
The joke with the Alamo. He stands up. What do you remember? I remember the Alamo. Yeah.
Yeah, that movie is so absurd. Let's talk about Return to Oz. What star rating would you give Return to Oz?
Probably a 3-star.
Three
Like
stars?
it started a little slow, but got pretty good.
Yeah, all right. I think that might be the lowest rated film we've done so far. I'd have to check. Can you give me a summary of what happens in the movie?
Nope.
Okay, I would summarize that movie as this little girl, Dorothy, has some behavioral issues. She's depressed and whatnot after a tornado tore their house apart. And so she goes to a mental health doctor, but escapes by going to the magical land of Oz.
Completely unintentionally.
Completely unintentionally. And then she goes on an adventure across the land of Oz against the evil Gnome King, and eventually destroys the Gnome King and escapes back to Kansas. At
Eggs
the
are
end.
poisonous.
Exit what?
Eggs are poisonous. Remember? That's how she killed the Gnome King with eggs.
Oh yeah, right.
That's why chickens are outlawed.
Oh God, I forgot about that. I was trying to remember how she killed the Gnome King. It's so weird, like that eggs are poisonous. It's never explained. Whatever.
Because the Gnome King needed a weakness.
Yeah, basically. That's probably an element in one of the books that they just didn't quite have time for in the movie. I don't know. So let's do some context. The movie stars, I'm going to butcher her name, Firuza Balk. I never know how to say it. She went on, of course, she was pretty young when she did this movie, but she went on to be kind of popular in the 90s. Most notably, most people listening to this will probably know her from a movie called The Craft in 1996, where she plays a member of a bunch of witches. Your mom loves The Craft. The movie also had, which I didn't realize until I was looking at it yesterday. The movie had a guy named, do you remember Jack Pumpkinhead?
Of
The
course it did.
Yeah, he was voiced and puppeted by a guy named Brian Henson, who is the son of Jim Henson,
Hmm.
you know, friend of the show, Jim Henson, who talked about a bunch of times. As far as I can tell, the Jim Henson studio didn't do the puppets, but Brian Henson was there as Jack. The puppets in this were pretty good, especially considering it was 1985. The movie is a sort of not really sequel to The Wizard of Oz from 1939.
What was the creature called that was it was a head? It was mounted onto a little like a plaque.
The Gump that Dorothy sprinkles the dust on and comes to life. Yeah, that was the Gump. The movie's so weird. Um, yeah, so The Wizard of Oz came out in 1939. It's a very, very old movie. This was not made by any of the same people, obviously, and isn't like a direct sequel. It's just kind of a sequel. It's based on some books written by a guy named L. Frank Baum. He started writing in 1900 is when Wizard of Oz came out. And he continued writing them up into like 1920, 21. He wrote 14 of them in all. The first movie, Wizard of Oz, was based on the first book called The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. This movie was based pretty heavily on the following two books: The Marvelous Land of Oz from 1904 and Ozma of Oz from 1907. It really meshes the plots of those two together. An interesting side story about these books: when you were super young, like 3 years old, your mom and I used to sit down and read a chapter from Wizard of Oz every night.
Yeah,
I think you still have that copy of the book on your bookshelf.
probably.
It was that and Alice in Wonderland were your two favorite books that we would read. The movie also uses stop motion, which I'm sure you noticed, for the Gnome King and like a bunch of stuff. Uses
And the
stop
Gnome
motion.
King's minions.
Yeah. That movie utilizes a very specific kind of stop motion that you just don't see at all, that kind of fell out of favor, called claymation, where instead of having a model that gets moved around for stop motion, it's actually sculpted between frames.
Huh.
So it's all sculpted by hand. And that's why you can get something that's kind of fluid and dynamic, like when the Gnome King melts, because it was all sculpted by hand. They didn't have to like make a new model every time. Do you have any questions for me about Return to Oz?
How did they do the gum?
The Gump, he was just a puppet. Pretty much everything in that movie was puppets. Every time Belinda talks, it's a puppet. And of course, Jack Pumpkinhead was a puppet.
The Wheelers?
The Wheelers weren't puppets so much as they were physical performers on stilts rolling around. Wheelers are so creepy in that movie. So, speaking of the Wheelers, a lot of people, like in my generation, who came to that movie pretty young, like I was, obviously, this movie came out well before my time, but I watched it when I was, oh God, probably like 5 or 6 years old, and it was freaky as hell. This is one of the, I've got like three movies that I have kind of vague recollections of watching when I was that age. It was this, Neverending Story, and or no, sorry, this, Dark Crystal. Speaking of Jim Henson, and The Black Cauldron, which was a Disney cartoon. And then of course I watched it again later. But yeah, And it was freaked the hell out of me. So, did you find any elements of this movie kind of creepy or unsettling or scary?
The machine. Like the machine that was gonna do whatever it was gonna do to Dorothy's brain.
Oh God, yeah. The that's an actual thing, electroshock therapy, and electroshock therapy was kind of new at the time that the movie takes place. But yeah, they really did hold people down, strap electrodes to their head, and kind of zap out the bad feelings. Electroshock therapy was still used like into the 2000s. It's crazy. It's so archaic. When I was, of course, you're a lot older than I was when I watched it, but I remember Mombi being super creepy.
Just the fact that she can take off her head.
Yeah, she could take off her head, and there was something about all the display cases full of her different heads. There was something about that that was just really creepy to me as a kid. A lot of people will talk about how creepy the wheelers were and that constant screeching, squeaky wheel noise. And then they've got the faces on the top of their head. Yeah. But that was the way they did the wheelers was they just had physical performers who had big stilts on their arms and on their feet that had wheels on them. And then they just had to get good at rolling around. Do you remember when you watched Inception? And afterwards, I said, was Cobb awake or dreaming through the whole movie? Do you remember me asking you about
I
that?
don't.
Okay. So in this movie, I have a similar question about this movie. Everything that happens in Oz, do you think it actually happened? Or do you think it might have been one of Dorothy's delusions?
I don't know. Cause like, why would Dorothy imagine Ozma basically telling her not to show Ozma to
Yep.
Aunt? Her aunt?
Her aunt. And the whole adventure starts, well, she has some hallucinations prior to that, or visions of Ozma, like in her hospital room and stuff. But everything starts like the moment she's about to get zapped, there's a lightning flash and all the power goes out.
Yeah.
So I think it all was in her head that she got zapped and kind of reverted into her hallucinations because she goes on that whole adventure and kind of deals with her PTSD. You know what PTSD is?
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah. Because it's shown that she has it really bad and her uncle also has it really bad. I don't know if you remember, her uncle couldn't get around and do chores. He was really depressed. And
yeah, until she came back.
Yeah, and he kind of got over it. So, plot structure or plot archetype again. This movie, I don't know if we've talked about a coming of age story as a plot archetype before. A coming of age story is kind of someone growing up, and it's a story. Their kind of character arc is they start out a child and they become either a teenager, or they start out as like a teenager and then by the end they kind of become an adult. So that's kind of the idea of the coming of age story. The original Wizard of Oz is that Dorothy has this whole dream and kind of wakes up like older for the experiences. This movie looks like a coming of age story, but I would argue that it's not. It kind of defies plot archetypes. And it's more of, I feel anyway, it's more of Dorothy dealing with mental illness and kind of confronting and overcoming mental illness. Do you have anything you want to add about Wizard of Oz?
No?
No? So next time we're doing 1986. We're going to watch Aliens. Finally, we talked about it enough times. We're also going to watch The Fly and Highlander. Do you know anything at all about The Fly?
No.
Good. Those of you listening along, you know what he's in for. It's great. We talked a little bit in the car yesterday about Highlander, and you had just kind of knew the name, right?
Yeah.
yeah, when we watch it, there are a few things that you will recognize as pop culture icons because they've made what, like fucking 10 Highlander movies or something at this point. Anything you want to say overall before we
No.
go into the ends? Okay. So thanks so much for sitting down with me. I always have fun doing this.
Me too.
Even if we don't get to do it as much anymore, I still really enjoy getting to sit down and talk about movies with you. Mostly it's an excuse to just sit around and hang out with you for a bit.
And watch movies.
Yeah, and watch movies. So those of you listening along, again, thank you for sitting down with us. If you are interested, the show is available on YouTube at my Screen Queen channel. That's Queen like a royal queen, Screen Queen. It's also available on Spotify, just under From Mad Max to the Matrix. We also have a Patreon if you're interested in helping us kind of continue doing what we do. You can find links for all that down in the description. And yeah, bye. See you next time.
Bye.